Biafra Britain's Shame. Chapter 6: The Crime of Genocide. The British Genocide Act of 1969, implementing the United Nations Convention on Genocide, defines genocide as any act falling within the definition of genocide in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. This article is annexed to the Act, and for the purpose of clarity, we give it here in full. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such: killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mentally harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Clause 1, Section 4 of the Act extends its application to any attempt, conspiracy, or incitement to commit such an offense. Nigeria is not a signatory to this convention, nor of course do Nigerian citizens in Nigeria fall under the jurisdiction of English law. There is little evidence that any British citizen has physically involved himself in any activity which might be described as genocidal by first effect: the shooting of civilians, mutilation and burial alive of children, deliberate bombing of civilian targets with genocidal as opposed to military intent, or physical implementation of the blockade in the knowledge that it was inflicting 10,000 civilian deaths a day, mostly among children, in the national, racial, ethnic group against which it was directed. If it is true that no British citizens were involved in any physical activity which can be described as genocidal by first effect, then the law's application can only extend to those within British jurisdiction who may be guilty of conspiracy or incitement to commit genocide. Before these can be established, it is necessary to establish that the crime of genocide, as defined in the convention given above, has in fact occurred. The main difficulty here is to establish the mens rea, or intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, or racial group. Since it refers to an attitude of mind, it can be met, and has constantly been met ever since the war began, with a blanket denial that any such intention existed. It is almost certainly the truth that in General Gowon's mind, and in the minds of at any rate most of his cabinet, the intention behind the launching of the war was not primarily genocidal. In other words, that any partial destruction of a national, ethnical, or racial group which resulted from it was incidental to its main purpose, which was the reunification of Nigeria. However, it is hard to see how this defense would stand up in court. The law does not distinguish between primary and secondary intent, and if it could be shown that General Gowon and the British government knew that the consequences of certain actions were genocidal, in that they were resulting in the partial destruction of a national, ethnical, or racial group, and that with that knowledge they persisted in those actions, then they have no defense against the charge that the resulting partial destruction of a national, ethnical, or racial group was intentional. The truth would appear to be that whereas the primary intent behind the launching of the war was not to destroy, in whole or in part, a group such as the convention lists, both the Nigerian government and those who supported it were prepared to use wholesale destruction of civilians as a means to the successful prosecution of the war, and the resulting partial destruction of a group was therefore intentional. A second line of defense can be dealt with very briefly. Since, even if it held water, no court on earth would be likely to accept that the death of some 1 to 2 million people can be justified by a legalistic quibble. Biafrans, the argument runs, did not compromise a national, ethnical, religious, or racial group. They were merely citizens of Nigeria, bound by its laws, and there is no statutory limitation on the amount of capital punishment which a sovereign nation can inflict in order to enforce its laws and defeat rebellion. The answer to this is that if such measures as are deemed necessary to suppress rebellion involved the intentional destruction in part of any group within the nation, they fall within the compass of the British Genocide Act. And anybody within British jurisdiction who conspired or incited to this end would be answerable at law. The provision of firearms for a known purpose certainly falls under the legal definition of conspiracy, even if incitement is harder to prove. It can be argued that the Biafrans are not a national group, but an ethnical one, if one denies the legality of the decision to secede by the Consultative Assembly of the Eastern Region, or it can be asserted that they are not an ethnical group but a racial one, if one accepts the suggestion without any evidence to support it, that the majority of the smaller tribes did not in fact wish to secede, but one cannot deny that as a group they fall into one of these three categories. So far as the British government is concerned, the invariable practice of its spokesmen has been to refer to the Biafrans as the Igbos, which reveals which category of grouping they accept. Before moving from the mens rea as it affects the British government's guilt in the conspiracy to commit genocide, one should touch upon the defense that the British did not know what was happening in Nigeria Biafra, that they honestly believed the starvation to be the result of a Nigerian blockade, but of General Ojukwu's refusal to accept the Nigerian offer of a land corridor from the north, and that they honestly accepted the report of the international observers who, as guests of the Nigerian government, visited those parts of the conflict which they were allowed to visit, to the effect that the arms they supplied and continue to supply were not being used for the extermination of civilians on a racial or tribal, I use the word synonymously in this context, basis. In the first matter, the British government knew perfectly well that the Nigerians were engaged in siege tactics, and that starvation is the logical end of siege tactics. The fact that they chose to believe that Nigerians were in certain circumstances and under certain conditions prepared to lift those siege tactics is immaterial. The responsibility for the result of a blockade must lie with those who impose it, not with those who refuse to accept the blockader's condition for its removal. Nigeria continued to harass relief operations in every way possible. The Prime Minister himself referred to Nigerian obstructionism as an obstacle to relief operations in replying to a parliamentary question in the last week of October 1968. Under these circumstances, it makes as much sense to talk of Biafran suicide as it would make to talk of anyone's suicide who refused to do something he was ordered on the pain of death. The blame inescapably attaches to the person who takes life, or in the words of the Genocide Convention, deliberately inflicts on the group condition of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. I base my statement that the government knew that Nigeria was engaged in siege tactics on the two statements already quoted. The first from Lord Hunt, chosen to investigate the problems of relief on behalf of the British government. The second from Major General H.T. Alexander, chosen by the government as a member of the military observer team. Here they are again. Lord Hunt, House of Lords, August 27, 1968. What are the facts which have continued for months to block the way to relief operations in Nigeria? The first is the fact of a state of siege. The siege has continued for several months, with the Igbos completely surrounded and cut off by land and water. Brutal and inhuman though it is, the very essence of siege tactics is to reduce the defenders to physical conditions which they can no longer endure. Major General H.T. Alexander, Letter to the Spectator, November 29, 1968. One has to understand or try to understand the federal government's point of view, which is that any form of blockade breaking is an act of war, in that it increases the will of the people to resist. An interesting feature of this last comment is the reflection it provides on Major General Alexander's anxiety to see the federal point of view. The activities of this international observer team provided one of the more farcical aspects of the propaganda war. From any point of view, Major General Alexander was a curious choice. It was surely unnecessary to appoint a person who was managing director of an oil handling company, London and Thames Haven Oil Wharves, which derived 75% of its profit from Shell UK and was later, April 1969, to be taken over by Shell UK. This firm is the major concession holder in Nigerian oil. Another of the observer team, Major General Raab from Sweden, was threatened with a flogging by Colonel Benjamin Adekunle, commander of the 3rd Marine Commando Division, if he persisted in requesting to visit an area at Elele and another village near Port Harcourt, where there had been reports of mass extermination. The general did not persist, but the team was eventually allowed to visit the area 2 weeks later, when they solemnly assured the world that they could see no evidence of a massacre. A third military observer, Brigadier Sir Bernard Ferguson, may well have embarrassed even his mentors in the FCO by the wholeheartedness with which he embraced the federal cause. In an article which he wrote in the Times on his return from Lagos, he implied that the Biafrans had started the war by invading the Midwest. This article suggested that he not only failed to consult any sources outside the Commonwealth Office and Nigerian government, but had even neglected to read the newspaper accounts of the start of the war, and had not quite been able even to master his Commonwealth Relations Office brief. However, an independent investigation into Biafra allegations of genocide was held, and it produced a report published in England on May 31, 1969. This inquiry was held under the auspices of the International Committee for the Investigation of Crimes of Genocide under the patronage of Cardinal Fetten, Chief Rabbi Kaplan, Pastor Westphal, President of the French Protestant Federations, and an international committee of lawyers including judges and lawyers from France, Russia, Mexico, Romania, Brazil, Venezuela, and Italy, under a British chairman, Professor Lopez Ray. The inquiry, conducted in Biafra and Nigeria from December 1968, took evidence from 650 people in Biafra and 490 in Nigeria, of which 342 were combatants. The officer responsible for conducting the inquiry, Dr. Mensah from Ghana, interviewed members of the International Observer Team and people serving in the administration on both sides. He records that no impediments were put in the way of his inquiry by either government. His conclusion, which was accepted by the International Committee, was that prima facie evidence of genocide and also of genocidal intention existed. Dr. Mensah lists 10 places at which investigations have convinced him that deliberate civilian massacres occurred since the war started. Asaba, where the massacre was also reported in the Observer. Benin, where the incidents were also described by Colonel Cruz O'Brien and Monsignor Rochelle, the emissary of Pope Paul. Sapele, Warri, Koko, Ogwashiukwu, Ishago, Enugu-Ezike, Nsukka, and Onitsha. He adds that he received reports and eyewitness accounts of massacres at other places, but was unable to investigate them in the time at his disposal. Dr. Mensah concludes his report after many stipulations about the difficulty of proving mens rea or genocidal intent with these words: I am of the opinion that in many of the cases cited to me, hatred of the Biafrans and a wish to exterminate them was a foremost motivational factor. So it might begin to look as if the intentions to exterminate the Biafrans as such, while possibly not existing in the minds of the Nigerian cabinet and high command, certainly existed at a lower level among the troops actually engaged in prosecuting the war, and that the Nigerian government, while expressly condemning genocidal activity in its code of conduct, accepted by military observers as proving the absence of genocidal intent, was nevertheless prepared to condone it to the extent of preventing the observer team from visiting Elele until whatever had happened there could be covered up. Methods of extermination listed by Dr. Mensah, including machine gunning of all males of Biafran origin in newly captured towns, conscripting of younger Biafrans for use as cannon fodder, burial alive of children with their executed parents in mass graves as Asaba, devastation of houses, farms and livestock in retreat, starvation, bombing, and other methods which Dr. Mensah relates in those cases where he was able to verify the incident. These include mass execution by the slitting of throats and chopping of heads in the marketplace of newly captured towns, the killing of unborn babies by slitting open the stomachs of pregnant women, the plucking out of eyes from prisoners of war, and the skinning of live Biafrans. In justice to the Nigerian authorities, it must also be said that there were strenuous, if intermittent, efforts to prevent these atrocities and even, on one occasion, the punishment of an offender. These occurred when a Nigerian lieutenant in the southern sector allowed himself to be televised shooting a bound prisoner whom he suspected of being an Igbo. Colonel Benjamin Adekunle, his divisional commander, ordered his immediate execution, also on television. But it was hard to escape the conclusion that this lieutenant's crime was not so much to have shot an unarmed prisoner as to have shot him on television. Certainly, it is a fact that scarcely a single person was brought to trial after some 30,000 Easterners had died in the 1966 massacres, many of which were conducted by contingents of the Nigerian army. And it may well be that these soldiers felt that their behavior was condoned. If the intercepted radio messages between Colonel Adekunle at Port Harcourt and Calabar Air Base of June 18, 1968 are genuine, they came from Biafran sources, then there is no reason to suppose that Colonel Adekunle was ever much concerned about the niceties of warfare. NAF Calabar. We will only do one mission because the bombs are not enough, which is the important one. Adekunle, Port Harcourt. Go to the Azumini and Aba, bomb the bastard civilians like mad. If genuine, this command was only in accord with his earlier pronouncement, which first appeared in the Telegraph, Netherlands, and was dismissed by Lord Hunt and other British visitors as a joke. Question: what will your soldiers do on entering a village where most of the farmers are not Igbo? Adekunle: we will shoot everything that moves. Question: what will your forces do in the Igbo heartland? Adekunle: shoot everything, even if it doesn't move. Question: do I understand that the food now in Lagos will never reach the refugee camps in your sector? Adekunle: your understanding is correct. It is fascinating to speculate on exactly how much was known to the British government on where the balance lay in their minds between reluctant acceptance of genocide as a regrettable but necessary tool for the protection of British interests and the active advocacy of a policy whose implementation would inevitably involve the crime of genocide. Certainly, the Foreign Secretary and his advisers knew of the starvation and continued to supply arms to be used in the blockade which brought it about. Certainly, They knew of the unpunished massacres in the north and in Lagos, which put the whole tragic course of events in motion. Certainly, they knew of the massacres at Benin and Asaba at the beginning of the war, because there was a deputy high commission in Benin and the Asaba, and other Midwestern massacres were widely reported. They could have learned about other massacres through reading the foreign press, most especially French, German, and Scandinavian. But they deliberately chose not to know what was happening and appointed the military observers to visit only one side of the conflict. It is not possible to believe, at any rate, for an Englishman that an entire section of the British official class was so wicked that it was prepared knowingly to encourage the perpetration of these acts. The explanation is obviously that Mr. Michael Stewart, Mr. George Thompson, Lord Shepherd, Mr. Maurice Foley, Mr. Harold Wilson, and the permanent civil servants in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, whether in Whitehall or in Lagos, deliberately chose not to know. It is hard to see how this makes them less culpable. One hears from time to time that different standards pertain in Africa, that it is not fair to judge an African war by European standards. Conceivably, there is an element of truth in this, although one should also point out that African history has never before known bloodshed on the scale of Nigerian Biafran War, and the only historical parallels are to be found in Europe. Similarly, we are assured that the African character in such and genocide is so much a way of life in Africa that Biafrans will soon forget everything they have suffered. The wives and families who have been wiped out, the homes destroyed and settled down when conquered into a united and prosperous Nigeria. The American Civil War is often cited as an example, although few bother to point out that it did not start with genocidal massacres of Southerners in the north, that it did not involve the deliberately encompassed death by starvation of 1 million children on one side, that only 500,000 people died in all, northern casualties being 3 times the heavier, and that neither side had reason to believe that the other was intent on its total destruction. One does not need to expose the illogicality of this attitude, nor the depths of callousness and contempt for African life which it reveals. It is sufficient to say that whatever standards may apply in Africa, different ones apply in Europe, and these are enshrined in the Genocide Act of 1969. It is no longer permitted for the English government to condone and support the crime of genocide even among Africans, and even to protect some oil investments which are mistakenly thought to be threatened. After the last European war, there were many Germans who claimed, perhaps truthfully, that they had no knowledge of the crimes being committed in their name. The English have no such excuse. All they can say in their own defense is that they were not interested. Whatever the future may hold for Biafra and the Biafrans, this extraordinarily disgusting episode in British foreign policy must mean the end of the road for Britain as a country fit for world power. Those few Englishmen who were interested and who did care can only address themselves now to seeing that reparation is made to the Biafran people for the appalling wrong which has been done to them, and that those responsible for our complicity in the crime of genocide are brought to justice.